years as a professional association this year. We're also celebrating the 90th anniversary of the modern Foreign Service, signing of the Rogers Act in 1924. AFSA represents, again, all the foreign affairs agencies in the United States government. So we have members, my constituency from the Department of State. We also have our USAID Foreign Service, Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Agricultural Service, and International Board of Broadcasting Governors. Just last month, I was actually up in New York and visiting the United Nations and looking at how we could increase ties actually between AFSA and some of the staff unions there at the UN. It was very interesting to hear from their perspective as another labor union the conditions of employment of the UN employees around the world. And one of the things that AFSA is very concerned about right now is the security of our foreign service employees when they're serving overseas. Post-Benghazi, the loss of life of 4 of our members of the Foreign Affairs family really prompted us to take another look at what we were doing, how we were doing it, and keeping our members safe. And the UN staff associations, the UN staff unions, actually play an integral role in how the UN conducts its diplomacy overseas with its footprint. And so it was very insightful for me to go up there from one labor union to another to hear about how we might be able to improve our interaction with the Department of State. So again, it's a great privilege to be here this evening and very excited to start up with this partnership. And with that, I'd like to introduce or pass this over to Ambassador Don Bliss, who will be introducing tonight's panelists. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, it's an exciting time for the United Nations Association for the National Capital Area 2 to launch this partnership with such a wonderful organization. Not just because my son happens to be an active member of AFSA, that's certainly an important part. And I'm sure he'd be here tonight, but he's got a commitment to babysit for our 18-year-old granddaughter, so I will have to give him the full report on tonight's events. We're delighted you can be with us today. As I say, this is a good way to begin a relationship that's very important to the UNA-NCA because of the incredible work that the members of your organization do and the expertise that you have. And you know, the UNA-NCA has over 1,000 members and 57% of them are under 40. We have a lot of students, graduate students, young professionals. And one of our landmark events every year is having several young professional career dinners where we bring together experts in the various fields of foreign policy, and they meet and mentor young professionals who are looking to advance their career in some area of international work. And certainly AFSA is filled with experts, and so this will, I think, be a very fruitful relationship for us. If you're not a member of UNA-NCA, we have brochures in the back. You actually join the UNA-USA, and then you designate UNA-NCA as your local chapter. We are the largest and, frankly, by far the most active chapter in the United Nations Association. And we have dozens of programs every year. For example, next Thursday, our International Law Committee will, in partnership with the American Society of International Law, have a discussion of the issue of remedies for the misconduct of UN peacekeepers. If you, like me, believe that UN peacekeeping represents a very cost-effective way to address the trouble spots around the world, it costs 1/7 of it what it costs to send US boots on the ground. And in fact, it doesn't bring to the United States the tremendous cost in blood and treasure and national prestige that sometimes comes along with being involved in endless wars abroad. So we very much believe the UN peacekeepers have a vital role to play, but they need good training, they need technical support, they need financial support from our US Congress and from the administration, and they also need to have a system of responsibility for their actions. And that panel discussion is going to get into some of the issues as to how you deal with misconduct, whether it's the cholera epidemic in Haiti, which allegedly was brought by the peacekeepers from Nepal, or whether it's some of the actions that have taken place in Africa. It will be a panel discussion by extraordinarily expert and talented international lawyers with very different points of view. One of the members of the panel will be the plaintiff's lawyer who's suing the United Nations on behalf of the patients because of the cholera epidemic. So that's an example of the next program that comes up, but we have programs all through the year. Our Model UN at the State Department is the culmination of our year-long Global Classrooms program, where we invite volunteers to help us work with middle and high school children, high school students throughout the area, 84 public schools throughout the DC area. Over 2,500 students participate in this classrooms program and learn how to negotiate, how to mediate, and how to advocate on important international issues like Syria or human trafficking or cybersecurity. It's really quite incredible to see a young student who couldn't tell you the difference between Brussels and Botswana begin to argue the case for Botswana and negotiating with Brussels at a General Assembly meeting when they're considering a resolution. So if you're not a member of UNA-NCA, I encourage you to get a brochure and join us. We'll have a lot of fun together. And now I come to the main course of the evening to introduce our two speakers. Actually, I think you have their bios, so I can be somewhat brief in my introduction. If I can find my glasses and read them. Wesley Reiser is the Human Rights Officer at the State Department International Organizations Bureau, and we're delighted he can be with us tonight. He's a member of the State Department Civil Service, and for the past 11 years he's spent working on such complex issues as the Middle East. He's been the Consular Desk Officer for Israel, Egypt, Yemen, and the United Arab Republic, and then a Desk Officer for the Israel and Palestine Affairs. And currently, he is the Officer in I.O. for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. Dr. Reiser has a range of responsibilities, including the Israeli-Palestinian issues, human rights in Iran, Syria, Russia, Belarus, Libya, and Palestine refugees, and creating policy on promoting human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. Ed Elmendorf, to his left. Ed has had a long career in international affairs and human rights. He started his career, it isn't in his background, but I understand he started his career as an aide to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, so that's something to be proud of, even though it does sort of mark your history a little bit. But what an incredible way to launch a career, and he's worked at the United Nations, in the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, in the UN Secretariat, as a junior foreign service officer, and then over 30 years in the World Bank with responsibilities ranging from policy planning to human resource management and macroeconomic reform and global health. But most importantly for us, Ed was the past president of the United Nations Association for the National Capital Area. And from that post, he became the president of UNA-USA and negotiated successfully the merger of UNA-USA into the UN Foundation family. So Ed has a long history. In fact, he's doing a little bit of history, I understand, of the UNA-USA, and it's incredible going back to Eleanor Roosevelt and some of the really stellar people who played a part in this association's work. We're not cheerleaders for the UN. We think the UN can be more effective. We think it should be strengthened. But it's really the one instrument of global cooperation. And as we know today, whether it's a disease pandemic or whether it's traveling safely through the air around the world or whether it's terrorism, there's no respect for sovereign borders. These issues are global issues. They require global cooperation to address. And the UNA-NCA is dedicated to working with the young professionals, the students, and the experienced career folks in trying to build public awareness and understanding of the vital work of the United Nations, including all its specialized agencies, which make it possible to travel safely around the world, avoid healthcare pandemics, and communicate fairly and openly around the world, among many, many other things. So it's a great institution. Our American public doesn't understand it as well as they should, but the UNA-NCA is very much committed to increasing that public understanding, and I hope you'll join us in this effort if you're not already a member. Now, the purpose of tonight's discussion between Ed and Wesley is to consider the U.S. policy toward the Human Rights Council, and now that we're a member, the United States is a member, what's going on there, and how effectively is the U.S. Participating in that organization in the work for human rights around the globe. So Ed and Wesley are going to engage in a discussion here. It's not a formal speech. And when they've exhausted what they have to say, we'll turn it over to questions from the floor. I think we probably won't need to go for 2 hours, but whenever people get a little itchy, back and get a cup of coffee or cookie, or when we think we're winding down, we'll just have an informal session. You can come up and talk, and we can continue it on a one-to-one, two-to-one basis. So, Ed, why don't you get us started here?
Thanks very much, Don. To what Don said, just a couple of other notes about my background. When I started out life in the Foreign Service, working at the U.S. mission to the UN, as the most junior arrival at the U.S. mission to the UN, I was assigned to work on the third committee of the UN General Assembly and related UN bodies, namely dealing with human rights. That's in itself an important commentary on what the UN looked like in human rights 40 to 50 years ago. The most junior person on the totem pole was assigned to lead the work. It was enormously stimulating for me, and I made a lot of things happen. But that in itself is a commentary. I would also like, by way of introduction, to do a little bit of a promotion for a book recently completed by Wes Reiser, The Black Book, Woodrow Wilson's Secret Plan for Peace. Wes is actually a professional geographer by origin with a PhD in geography, and he examines Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the work that underlay that from that standpoint. So I commend that to you also. Our focus tonight really is on the UN Human Rights Council, but before we start talking more seriously about the Human Rights Council, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Council is only one aspect of the UN's human rights work and human rights machinery. In addition to the Council and its predecessor, the Commission on Human Rights, going back to the UN Charter, in 1994, the UN established the position of High Commissioner for Human Rights, very important independent position. And here I have a book on the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, As Conscience for the World, edited by Felice Guerre. Felice Guerre is an American member of the UN treaty body overseeing the enforcement of the UN Convention Against Torture, and she has been following human rights work internationally and particularly at and around the UN for many, many years. So you should learn more about the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and then also, again, while it's not the central focus of this evening, I want to draw your attention to what is called in UN parlance special procedures. Very hard to know what that might mean. The UN has a whole series of different kinds of special procedures for addressing human rights issues. These are sponsored by the Human Rights Council. I have another book here by Ted Picone of the Brookings Institution, Catalysts for Change: How the UN's Independent Experts Promote Human Rights. And the work of these independent experts, sponsored by the Human Rights Council, but not formally subject to its instruction, very important distinction, in my mind, is becoming more and more important in the public discussion about human rights globally. With that, let's get on to the Human Rights Council 2014. I'd like to start by putting the 2014 session in a larger context of the long-term evolution of UN human rights activity. In my days, you could already see it was something that was very junior, didn't get very much attention, People who had a complaint might write a letter to the UN, and that would just get buried somewhere in the bureaucratic sands of the organization. There was no High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Human Rights Division was headed by a director, a distinguished Canadian lawyer, but it didn't get much traction. We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948, spent many years working on the subsequent formulation of that in international treaties as the UN covenants. Finally, they were adopted in 1966, but their enforcement has also been problematic at best. Now, against that context, Wes, why don't you start out making some comments on how you see the present council in this longer term?
This might hot.
Oh, it works, doesn't it?
Yeah. So this actually, coming into 2014, we're really moving into sort of an interesting period as to how the Human Rights Council is addressing human rights issues at the UN. In 2006, the old Commission on Human Rights was abolished by the UN General Assembly. It had really become a rather moribund institution over time, and was viewed as being ineffective. And the council was created, but the Bush administration was not pleased with the way in which the council was created and some of the rules and agenda items under it. And so the United States actually boycotted the HRC for the first 3 years of its existence. But once President Obama was elected, we announced a candidacy for that upcoming term to the HRC, and we're now entering our second year of our second consecutive term on the council. So states serve for 3 years, 47 members on the council total. You can serve for up to 6 years and then actually have to step aside. The council has become a lot more active, I would say, over time, and now almost at a frantic point where I think a lot of member states look at it, and even including the United States, and wonder how can we funnel the council's energy in appropriate directions, prioritize certain issues. But we're expecting to see over 40 resolutions as it looks right now at the upcoming March session alone, and the Human Rights Council will adopt over 100 resolutions. It will meet for a total of at least 10 weeks, more if there are special sessions called over the course of this year, and consider everything from major thematic issues in human rights to country-specific situations all around the globe. Quite a different body than what we saw in the past, and one that really is now engaging in relative real time, actually, to respond to critical situations around the globe, especially ever since the outbreak of the Arab Spring. It's really gone from being an institution that sort of looked at thematic issues in a handful of repeat offender countries that are sort of the worst around the globe, to being an institution that also engages on situations as they develop. And that started with engagement on Libya, it's continued with engagement on Syria. The Council has now held its special session on the Central African Republic earlier this year. That was the first meeting of the HRC with its new membership. And I think that really just shows what a tremendous change we've seen over time and how important US engagement has been in that.
Wes, what about the council's effectiveness? You spoke a little bit about getting going this year and new issues and the Arab Spring and so forth. And does it really make any difference?
It really depends on the situation and the issue that it takes on. Just like any UN institution, of course, there are areas where the council could be more effective than it is. But I think there are quite a few areas that are in the headlines right now where the council is doing really important work. And I would highlight specifically 3 that we've seen recently in the news for that. First off, which has been in the news very much in the past week, the council last March created a commission of inquiry to investigate the human rights situation in North Korea. And the situation in North Korea is, by most standards, the worst of any country on the face of the earth, with gulag system in place that was reminiscent of that under Stalin in the Soviet Union, disappearances, parents being forced to kill their own children. I mean, really, the scale of violations that are taking place there are really unprecedented anywhere else in the world today. And the council created this mechanism that, although they did not get into North Korea, traveled to South Korea, to Japan, to the United States, to several countries in Europe, and they were able to interview defectors who've escaped North Korea, collect the testimony of witnesses, and really shine a light and increase international attention to the situation they're in. And their report has picked up a huge amount of media attention and brought a state that otherwise, unless they're testing a nuclear weapon or making some sort of threat towards South Korea, really is outside of the headlines. They're able to bring the violations that are taking place in that country to the forefront. A second example that's a more acute situation is the Council's addressing of the situation in Syria. And the Security Council, which really is the UN body that should be addressing the Syrian situation as the preeminent body on peace and security at the UN, has of course been completely hamstrung by Russia and China's double vetoes. The Council has only passed, the Security Council has only passed a single resolution on Syria, which codified the chemical weapons deal that Syria is now slow rolling and has failed to meet the deadlines that the Security Council has set. If you switch to the other side and you look what has been done in Geneva, the Human Rights Council held its first special session on Syria in April of 2011, only 1 month after the protests broke out, and really before Syria had even devolved fully into a civil war. At that point, it was a government attacking peaceful protesters in the streets. And the Human Rights Council, of course, does not have the legal authority to create a peacekeeping operation. They don't have the authorities to impose sanctions. But what they do have the authority to do is to, one, maintain international attention and build international consensus on these issues. And the Council voted 40-1 on its last resolution last September on Syria. So it's very different than what's happening at the Security Council. But more importantly, they also created a commission of inquiry, which is an independent body, just like the special rapporteurs and independent experts, but it consists of several eminent individuals and a large staff that are traveling to all of the countries where there are Syrian refugees. They Skype into Syria regularly. They've collected thousands of individual testimonies from regular Syrians about the war crimes that are taking place across Syria, and they will be the instrumental institution in bringing to justice Assad and the members of his regime and members of the opposition that are violating international human rights and humanitarian law in Syria. And so I think that's hugely important. And the last one I won't go into any detail on, but I think the recent action on Central African Republic shows that the Council can respond in real time to crises as they break out. Of course, that was a country that wasn't even on anybody's radar screen 6 months ago, and the Council has already come together and created an independent expert that will be working with the African Union's Commission of Inquiry to bring about truth and reconciliation in Central African Republic.
Let me push it a little bit further, Wes. I'll be a devil's advocate. This is all well and good, and we get DPRK on the front page of the Washington Post with a Commission of Inquiry. What impact is it having, or is the Council having, on the lives of people in individual countries? It's pretty unlikely from what we see now that there will be a significant impact directly from the Commission of Inquiry on DPRK, and I think you're right that evidence collected in the case of Syria could become very important when and if any of the Syrian leaders are presented to the International Criminal Court, but that's a pretty dicey proposition and a long way down the road, if at all. So let me just push you a little bit further on how you see the priority and balance between various forms of UN human rights activity. The UN, it started out establishing norms in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's worked on norms and continued in various ways ever since. But so the norming activity continues. There's a second dimension quite different from the way, what we talked about thus far, that I would describe as collaboration, which is an open and direct collaboration with individual countries on human rights situations in those countries and human rights practices. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has human rights officers in quite a large number of countries now, operating out of UN offices. Those things tend to be very quiet, not talked about publicly, very different from the third dimension of what I would call naming and shaming, which is what you emphasized, Wes, in talking about DPRK and Syria. Can you comment on the balance among those and how you see them playing out?
Well, the reason we talk so much about the naming and shaming exercises, I think those are the most difficult diplomatic lift, and that's where U.S. diplomats that are serving at the UN have to focus on the majority of our energy and attention. But the cooperative work, I think, is incredibly important and also is institutionalized through the Council itself. So in certain cases, that actually involves the Human Rights Council creating what we refer to as independent experts, rather than a special rapporteur on a country is usually in the role of naming and shaming that country. For an independent expert, depending on the country that they are working with, that can vary a lot. But I think an excellent example is there's an independent expert on Cote d'Ivoire, there's an independent expert on Somalia, and on Haiti. These are people who have been asked by the Human Rights Council to work with a government to improve the situation. And what they do is they complement this other work. The Office of the High Commissioner both provides human rights monitors and other personnel to peacekeeping missions, but more importantly, I would say they open their own offices, which are doing incredible work in many countries around the world, in which the U.S. Provides a lot of additional monetary assistance as well to the OHCHR to do. Of those, the ones that I have the most experience with are the offices that are working in Yemen and Tunisia right now, since I work more on the Middle Eastern region, but there are regional offices in Cambodia, in Colombia, in Guinea, many other countries around the world. And what's really important is these folks are able to work very quietly and behind the scenes with governments, with civil society, on a whole range of important issues, be it on how to properly conduct an election and how to monitor an election, on judicial training, on police training, so that police will respect people's human rights and their right to assembly, and et cetera. In the case of both Tunisia and Libya, OHCHR is working directly with the governments on drafting their new constitutions.
And they don't get thrown out for confrontation?
And they don't. That's what's amazing. And I think part of it is once a government lets them in, it can stay quiet as long as OHCHR can do their work. And it only will become loud if they happen to kick them out. The council actually takes direct action on some of these cases as well, through resolutions that are adopted under the cooperation agenda item of the council. And the council, just at its upcoming session, will be adopting several resolutions where the HRC will work with an individual UN member state. And what this allows is not only for OHCHR to do its work on the ground, but then for a state to actually step up before the Human Rights Council and make a commitment to the international community that they are going to improve their human rights record and change it. And I think that, in and of itself, has an incredible value because it allows this to take place in a much more public manner than it would otherwise.
Can you give us some cases?
Yeah, so Libya and Yemen are two that I work on that are cooperative resolutions. There are quite a few in Africa. There's one for Haiti. We hope, if the situation continues to improve in Burma and they open up, that an office of the High Commissioner will open later this year there, and that we'll be able to switch from condemnatory to cooperative work. And I think that's actually a really interesting example, because as that transition takes place, which has already taken place with Libya, by the way. It shows that you can go from shaming a country to transition to a cooperative work between the United Nations, human rights system, and that particular state. And those are just a few of those examples. On the norming side, at this point, really our focus there is both on combating the continued challenges that we see around the world to it, to freedom of expression, freedom of association, et cetera, to also expanding the scope and definition of whom is protected by international human rights law. And the particular group of people that the US is most focused on there right now, and it is incredibly contentious work, is on ensuring that that human rights protections apply to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, because in 77 countries around the globe, LGBT status or conduct is criminalized, and in 9 of those countries, there's actually a death penalty just for being gay. This is something that wasn't even spoken about at the UN until the year 2004 at all, and we already have passed a resolution, and that resolution and the continued work gives space for people that are fighting for their own basic rights around the world, the support of the international community. And in many cases, these norming exercises are actually quite valuable because individuals who, as long as there's actually a real court system in the country, US courts are pretty leery of UN resolutions, but in many other countries around the globe, UN resolutions can actually play a very important role in how a judiciary will rule on a certain case. And so these LGBT resolutions at the UN may actually help open the space for people to be able to challenge these criminal statutes in court and allow the Supreme Courts of these countries to strike some of these discriminatory laws down.
This is also, I would say, an enormous change in the way the UN goes about human rights work by comparison with my days years ago. You have in your material somewhere a letter from one of the senior UN officials to Felice Guerre, the chair of the UNA-USA Leo-Neves Human Rights Task Force, about the Secretary General's positions on the LGBT issues at the Olympics. It's remarkable to me to see an official in the UN Secretariat daring to go so public on this issue. No UN official would have dared to do that 30, 40 years ago. Now, in the case of the LGBT populations, there have been resolutions on which they can rely. Nonetheless, the fact of doing it, the fact of the Secretary General saying it at the Sochi Olympics, is a really remarkable change. Now, what is that going to mean for the longer term? I think particularly of an especially sensitive issue now of human rights defenders. There are a lot of human rights defenders around this country and around the world who are working day in and day out to help people who have run into one kind of a problem or another with their own authorities. And the UN has adopted some resolutions on human rights defenders, and the Human Rights Council has adopted resolutions supporting that. Now, some of that is under threat. The spoiler countries managed to defer action on these issues in the last session of the UN General Assembly. Now, what can be done about those issues?
I think human rights defenders is one of the real important priorities for the United States because, of course, in many states around the globe, not only is an individual's human rights violated, but then a lawyer or other people who will stand up to protect those rights, they face sanctions as well within their own country. And we were strongly supportive of the Human Rights Council resolution that Hungary ran last September, which called for the creation of a UN focal point for human rights defenders. It would essentially be an address by which all human rights defenders that are under threat around the globe could reach out to the UN to seek both assistance and also just highlighting their case. For a lot of states that are doing this, they do it with impunity, but they're actually quite terrified of having this broadcast publicly. And the naming and shaming by the UN is effective often in getting human rights defenders released. So there's a real value to it. Unfortunately, this is the UN, and the UN is a far from perfect institution, and one of our greatest challenges in the Third Committee this last fall was a procedural resolution on the report of the Human Rights Council, which is presented by the African group of countries without any consultation or negotiation. They added a paragraph that called for the General Assembly to reconsider this one resolution. The exact modalities about how that reconsideration will take place remain quite unclear. We're working to try and ensure that the chair of the Third Committee, who's from Bulgaria, a country that co-sponsored the resolution, will steer the process. And Hungary, as the lead sponsor, will be the lead state to steer the process. But the bad actors are going to try and undo this in some way. And so we do face some diplomatic setbacks and challenges, but the US is going to be engaging very much between now and the end of this General Assembly session to ensure that in the end the General Assembly reaffirms what was passed by the Human Rights Council and doesn't in some way chip back at its authority. We're worried about it not just in the context of human rights defenders, but also just in the context that the HRC passed over 100 resolutions last year. And this is unprecedented for the General Assembly to renegotiate something after it's already been adopted. The General Assembly elects these 47 countries to sit on this body, and if this resolution can be renegotiated, then also that opens the question as to what's next.
Let's push that one a little bit further, Wes. This brings us to the criticism offered by some of the countries on different ends of the political spectrum that the UN's human rights work infringes on sovereignty. Mm-hmm. This is certainly the argument of the spoilers in that case, and we hear some similar kinds of echoes in this country as we think also about the UN special procedures in relation to the US. Could you comment on the sovereignty issue and how you see that playing itself out and where it goes from here?
I don't think it's ever going to play itself out. I think it's always going, that tension is always going to exist at the UN between states having that sovereignty under international law to do as they please within their borders, and a continued growing international consensus, but it is far from consensus yet, that there are certain norms that rise beyond the sovereignty right. And the HRC exists right on the cusp of that sort of tension in the international legal system. We're going to continue to see it play out because there's a group of countries that believe that there's only one mechanism by which the UN human rights system should speak it to member states' human rights records, and that is the Universal Periodic Review. For every 4 years, each country presents a report to the UN on their human rights record. Other states of the UN, not just the HRC members, by the way, but any UN member state, also has the right to then comment on that report and also issue recommendations to that state to improve their record. When the US participated in its UPR, that in and of itself raised a whole chorus of objection among certain groups in the United States that believed that that was infringing upon our sovereignty. But the view of the current administration is the exact opposite, that the US shouldn't be ashamed of its human rights record. We of course have room to improve here at home, as every society does, and that we should be open to a dialogue with the rest of the world on that. Similarly, with these special procedures, up to 2 a year are allowed to visit any given country. The US accommodates 2 visits every year, and we don't only accommodate visits from special rapporteurs that we like. We bring in special rapporteurs that have been created by Cuba at the Human Rights Council that are pushing human rights issues that we don't necessarily agree with. We bring in special rapporteurs that are on issues that we care about, where we have problems at home, and we are open to that. And we are open to having the indigenous rapporteur go around the United States, visit reservations as he did last year, and then issue a report that was quite critical of the United States government and of state governments.
With a press conference.
Yes, and that's fine. we think that it's important to lead by example, and that example means that sometimes you have to sit through difficult criticism of your own, and we think that that's a healthy process. There are other states that object to this entirely and believe that the UN should not single out individual states and that only kind of broad global norms should be addressed at the HRC. Russia and China lead that chorus. The non-aligned movement used to lead that chorus, and some members still claim that they do, but the non-aligned movement has actually totally splintered on that, which has been to great advantage for us. It's a huge accomplishment, and we started to break them off in about 2009 and really start to break that consensus. Syria is what did it in once and for all, because even then you had countries like Saudi Arabia that are of course very afraid of having a resolution run against them because of their human rights record, who for the first time voted yes on a country-specific resolution at the UN. And so we're working to continue to try and knock those walls down. We've gotten India to do it on Sri Lanka. We've gotten Philippines to do it on Belarus. Some of these countries are only doing it on 1 or 2 states right now. But they can no longer say we oppose the UN looking at situations in countries, because we can point back to their previous vote record and show that indeed that is not their national view anymore. And so I think we're winning that argument, but we're winning it very slow, and the tension is always going to be there, and there will always be a set of outlier states. Right now, that set of outlier states is a pretty embarrassing club to be in. It's North Korea, Cuba, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, China, Sri Lanka. There are a handful of other states that vote with them all the time, and those countries are finding that that is isolating them in their broader relationships with the United States, with the European Union, with Brazil, with Argentina, with Mexico. So it's not even only with the West, but it's with a broader group of countries that are making human rights a priority.
But what you're saying is, it just again, looking at it in a longer term perspective, going back to my days decades ago, Article 2.7 of the UN Charter, which is the one that forbids the UN for intervening in any matter considered to be essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of member states. That frontier of what is domestic jurisdiction has shifted remarkably over the years. And I think it's attributable to the UN, it's attributable to a lot of changes around the world. Nonetheless, the fact that it has shifted in that way and is, to my mind, very remarkable and very unlikely to be reversed.
I think that's right.
And that in itself opens up all sorts of new possibilities. Now, let's talk more specifically, Wes, about the U.S. and its performance in the Council. You said that the Obama administration had stood for election, won election, and then stood for re-election. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that re-election, what went on around that, and maybe even something about your own role. But more importantly, tell us also about the impact you see that the U.S. has had and will have in the future on the Council.
Sure. As to our election the first time, we were elected that year on a clean slate, which makes it fairly easy.
Clean slate, you have to explain.
So a clean slate means there were 3 seats for the Western Europe and Others group, and 3 candidates standing. So you get elected as long as a majority of the General Assembly writes your country's name down on a blank ballot, and that's key, is the country names aren't actually even there. So you still have to run a campaign. But the campaign was quite simple. The Western European and Others group, which the U.S. happens to belong to, our member states on clean slate elections get the lowest number of votes of any around the world. And I think that's because countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and France, et cetera, we're willing to stand up and say things that are relatively unpopular and are not only interested in consensus. We are also interested in bringing tough issues to the forefront. But the U.S. did win that election easily. We ran for re-election in 2012, And just for the purposes of transparency, I was our campaign manager for that particular election. It's maybe the single most difficult thing I've had to work on in 11 years at the State Department. I lost a few hairs while doing it. That was a contested election with 5 countries running for 3 seats from our region, and the other 4 candidates were Ireland, Sweden, Greece, and Germany. It's hard to sling mud at your good friends and allies, and of course every one of those states falls very much into that camp. Also, all of them, however, at the UN, Sweden to a lesser extent than the others, but engage in a game of vote trading at the United Nations that I would say is most akin to sort of student council election kind of games that you would see in an American high school, where countries will agree, I will vote for you for this UN body if you vote for me for that one. The United States, and believe it or not, the only other country that has a principled position against vote trading is Russia. But it probably dates back to the old superpower days, in the early days of the UN. We do not engage in vote trading. We believe that states should be elected on the merits of their candidacies. We do not make promises to other countries and tell them we will vote for them. We tell them we'll vote on the merits. For the Human Rights Council on a contested slate from other regions, that makes it pretty easy to know who the US actually is going to vote for when you look at sort of the slate that's standing. But it made it very tough for us because we were running against 4 countries, all of which had announced before the United States. Ireland had announced in 2006, and Greece in 2007 for an election in 2012. The US was still boycotting the council when they started their campaign and started collecting these trades. So it was a huge challenge to convince states that they should vote for the United States based on our record. And we said that the reason you should vote for us is because the US is an instrumental member of the Human Rights Council. We go there and we will engage on tough issues, and we will move on both thematic and country-specific issues, both in cooperative and combative mode, depending on what we need to do. But that the council is more effective with the US as a member than with the US on the sidelines. And the international community agreed with us because we won 131 votes. That's more than any of our 4 competitors. We were the only contested slate that year, and they announced the Western Europe and others group last. And they had announced the other groups from the highest to the lowest vote getter. You already knew who had won because there were only as many countries running as there were seats. But when they got to us and they said the US first, the first thing flashed around my mind was, oh no, what if they're going in reverse order? And then the President of the General Assembly said 131. At that point, I knew that we had secured it, and not only that, that we had finished in first. So I think that was quite a remarkable testament that it's not just the US that thinks this, but that there are a lot of countries around the world that agreed with the United States that that the US membership was important and that it was essential to keep the US on the council. We run a lot of things on our own, but what we also do is a lot of the behind-the-scenes diplomatic work on tough issues that other countries run. So I'll give you a good example. The first project I worked on in the Human Rights Council was to create the Special Rapporteur on Iran. When the Human Rights Commission was abolished, the Iran mandate, along with the Cuba and Belarus mandates, were abolished at that time as part of the compromise deal that created the HRC, which was an appalling compromise. The US made it one of our first big goals upon getting back to get that particular rapporteur in place. But if you walk into the Human Rights Council on March 27th this year, when the Iran Special Rapporteur is renewed, you will not see the United States introducing the resolution. You'll actually see Sweden introducing that resolution on behalf of a group that includes the US. But the US, in the cases where other states run important issues, we have a broader diplomatic reach than any other country in the world. And we've changed the Human Rights Council from being an ambassadors club of independent operators in Geneva who vote for issues based on their friendship or what a good cocktail party another ambassador can throw, to a group of ambassadors who have to vote based on what their capitals tell them. Because every important issue we raise at very high levels back in their capital city, and they get instructions that have broken that Geneva Ambassadors Club to pieces and have really turned the HRC into an institution that is accountable to its own, the governments of the states that are members. And it wasn't that before we were there. So that in and of itself, I think, is a tremendous change.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the 131 votes that you marshaled for the U.S. How did that number compare with the tabulations that you had within the State Department about what you were expecting?
Sure. Well, I can't tell you the exact number of votes that we were supposed to get, but you can FOIA that and see if they'll declassify it for you. But it'll be out there eventually. But it's a secret ballot at the UN, and so these elections are held in secret. So even if I promise you and we exchange diplomatic notes that we're going to vote for each other, who you actually write down on the piece of paper that day could be anybody you want. And so you always have to have a discount rate at play. And I will just say that the statistical model I built, I worked with statisticians at the CIA, and as a social scientist academic myself, we worked to run a campaign that was informed by actual models and run in a scientific fashion. And my discount rate was right on, and we were one vote different from my projection as to where we would get, which was quite a few votes less than, quite a few votes more were promised to us than 131. But we hit it pretty much right on the nail, better than I ever could have hoped for. But that's just the reality of the situation, and we will never know which countries promised to vote for the United States that didn't.
Secret ballot.
It is a true secret ballot. The CIA doesn't have a camera up on the ceiling, and we get little pictures of these things, so we actually have no idea who the states voted for, and which states stabbed us in the back in the end.
But, yeah, but what we don't see though, Wes, is the U.S. being prepared for the March session of the Human Rights Council with a new U.S. ambassador to the council. There's pending confirmation on Capitol Hill. That's not the only position which is important to U.S. international human rights work. The chair of the Leo Nevis Human Rights Task Force of UNA-USA has written to Senator Reid calling for the Senate to move forward with these confirmations. What's going on here? What sort of an impact is this likely to have on U.S. performance in the March session of the Council?
I wish I could run the same whip operations I do at the UN with the U.S. Congress, and unfortunately that's not the case. We will be without an ambassador, most likely for the March session. I mean, even if the Senate acts in mid-March to bring in an ambassador midway through a session, he will have no relationships with these other ambassadors. But we have actually an incredible charge d'affaires in Geneva right now, who is named Peter Mulrain, who was previously our Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, who's an incredible Foreign Service officer and is very engaged and does know the reps in Geneva very well. This has not slowed us down at all as to, one, what we're going to do at the March session, or two, the steps we're taking to prepare for it. So the U.S. will be running 2 resolutions. We'll be running a resolution on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, and we'll also be running a resolution to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression. We'll also be working really hard on Iran, on Syria, on South Sudan, on Libya, on Burma, on North Korea, on freedom of religion or belief. So we've got a full plate, and we will be as engaged as if we had an ambassador in place. But it really, the place where it does us damage, to be quite frank, more than anything else, is the U.S. has said that we are committed to this institution. And when President Obama appointed Eileen Donahoe as our first ambassador to the Human Rights Council, that was the first time that the U.S. had created an ambassadorship specific to the UN's preeminent human rights institution. The former Commission on Human Rights, it had always been our ambassador to the Economic and Social Council, who had served in that particular role. And so that sent an important signal to the international community. Our inability to have somebody in that seat sends a signal as well, and it isn't a good one. But we will be as aggressive, and I know that we will achieve all of our objectives without having an ambassador in place, but it will be essential to filling out the last 2 years of this current term, as well as to campaigning for the United States re-election in 2016, which we have already started our campaign for, to have that ambassador in place.
Now let's talk a little bit about NGOs and the Human Rights Council. I'd like you to expand a little bit on how you see the NGO roles there, and particularly what you think NGOs can do and the UNA can do here and elsewhere to make the council more effective, to make sure that Uncle Sam follows through in the way that he needs to, and to improve the council's performance.
Sure. Well, first I'll talk a little bit about how we interact with NGOs. We believe that our role on the HRC is to represent the entire American people, not just the State Department, right? And that is why we ran for the seat to begin with. And so we engage in very robust consultations. The State Department consults with a whole array of different NGOs that are interested in human rights issues internationally prior to and after every single HRC session. And then, of course, a lot of staff level people like myself meet regularly with members of the NGO community to discuss upcoming issues and to solicit their views and input into what we should be doing at the UN. I mean, up to the point where we are actually going to be nominating an American soon to fill a seat on the Committee on Human Rights, which is one of the most important treaty bodies at the UN. And we spoke to Felice Guerre on behalf of the UNA to solicit her views on who we think should run, along with a lot of other preeminent individuals from outside of the US government who we think have an important role to play in informing how we interact with these institutions. How they interact with the institutions themselves is also incredibly important to the United States. The Human Rights Council is an interesting body in that it reserves a certain amount of its speaking time to NGOs, both on the agenda items, but also on the Council's dialogues with its different special procedures or panels of preeminent human rights experts. And we fight very hard to ensure that those NGOs can be accredited, that those NGOs can attend and participate in Council sessions. And there are other countries that do everything they can to keep them away. And so we engage very hard to do that, so much so that even in certain cases, NGOs from developing countries that do not have a lot of resources themselves, we have funded to bring to Geneva to engage on issues that they are working on when those come before the Council. It's very important that the Council isn't just a bunch of boring government reps like myself sitting around reading from pre-cleared talking points, but that we can bring in the viewpoints of the people who are being impacted by these decisions. And that's going to remain a tense issue because countries like China, especially, but many others as well, work very hard to try and keep those voices out of the room. The other way NGOs can really interact, and I think play an important role, is also in pushing different states. We like to be pushed by the NGOs. We can't do everything that you ask of us, but it's important that we continue to hear back on what we can do better and on what we're not addressing, and should. In the same way, there are many other responsive governments that sit on the HRC that need to be hearing from their own governments about what they do. And maybe the most dramatic example of where this worked was South Africa has protections for LGBT people built into their constitution, and they had been trying to slow roll action at the Human Rights Council. LGBT NGOs in the US and Europe and Latin America contacted their counterparts in South Africa, who of course had no idea that their government was pursuing policies at the UN that ran counter to their own constitution and their values. And they protested in front of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs every day. There was a sit-in until they got a meeting with the foreign minister, and a month later South Africa introduced the first UN resolution on LGBT rights.
Well, that's the way it should happen.
It's exactly how it should happen.
And this too, again, is a commentary on the incredible change in the way human rights work and NGO work goes on at the UN. I had the privilege of being the U.S. representative in the NGO committee of the UN Economic and Social Council years and years ago. And my principal role at that time was to do whatever I could to prevent the accreditation of Communist Front NGOs. That's what Uncle Sam cared about in those days. The rest was fine. On that note, let's open up. And
This has been a delightful dialogue and conversation. Thank you very much, both of you. And let's open it up for any questions from the floor. I wonder if you would identify yourself, if you're comfortable in doing so. And if anybody has a question, maybe I'll start out with one myself. Do Israeli-Palestinian issues come up before the Human Rights Council? And if so, what position does the United States take on those issues?
Not only do they come up, but unfortunately, that falls under my portfolio as well. I would say that is the one range of issues where the U.S. has had the least success in changing the dynamics of the Council. We are not opposed to Israel and the Palestinian situation being addressed at the HRC as long as it is addressed in the same way as other states are addressed. That is unfortunately not the reality, and is one of the reasons why the Bush administration boycotted the HRC. It has 10 agenda items. Agenda item number 7 is the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. It is the only agenda item that is dedicated to a single country, and Israel is the only country that faces a whole slew of resolutions each year during the March session dedicated to it. Between special sessions and all the other and a resolution each regular session, Syria actually tied Israel for the number of resolutions last year. So we're gauging our success mostly on our ability to turn the Council's attention elsewhere. We have not been able to abolish any of it. But we have had some successes. Israel had cut its ties to the Human Rights Council in 2012 when a fact-finding mission on settlements was created by the HRC over the objections of the United States. We were unfortunately the sole country to vote against that fact-finding mission. The Europeans abstained, everybody else voted for it. We're always outnumbered on these issues at the UN. The US view is very different from that of other countries on the Israel-Palestinian situation. And the UN in that respect is a broader reflection on the sort of international view of that conflict. But at the HRC, we managed to get Israel to come back and do their UPR review. It went quite well. It didn't look any different than the UPR of any other country. They received a lot of critical recommendations, but they also received a lot of recommendations that are quite reasonable, and we think that it went very well. And Israel was finally admitted into the Western European and others group after its UPR in Geneva. And since that time, their foreign minister has met with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They've reopened a dialogue with her office. And Israel showed up at the organizational meeting for the HRC in January. So they're back.
This is really an important shift, because when the Israelis said we're disassociating ourselves from the Council, that could have also had a steamroller effect with other countries then doing the same thing, and the whole arrangement could have unraveled.
It absolutely could have.
And then the whatever strength had been built up over some years could have been dissipated in a year or two.
Yeah, and we were very much worried if Israel didn't do their UPR, that would have then led to North Korea and Iran and China and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, a whole domino effect of other countries stopping to engage with a universal UN mechanism. We dodged that bullet. We'll see if Syria does show up for theirs or not. They're probably the next test case as to whether somebody will show up or not. But having Israel back at the table is important, and getting them to the regional group also has led to us really pivoting to say, we are not going to get rid of item 7 as long as until there's a final agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. That's the reality. We will continue to work towards abolishing it before that, but that's when it's going to disappear. But that doesn't mean that Israel can't engage in other ways with the system. And Israel, prior to its disengagement, had allowed several different special rapporteurs into Israel and the West Bank to write reports and to meet with people. And we hope that they will go back to doing that again now that they've re-engaged. And we also want to work with them proactively on a positive agenda at the UN and at the Human Rights Council, so that they aren't only speaking up about their view of the conflict that they're involved in, but that they can also engage on important issues. I mean, Israel has its human rights problems at home, but they have one of the most robust free presses anywhere in the world, and they should be engaging on a host of different issues like freedom of expression, et cetera, at the UN, where they actually have a really good story to tell.
Thank you. Question? Yes.
I have a question for you. Why do you think
Identify
that
yourself.
Tell us who you are.
Bashir, by the way? Why do you think that the HRC failed with respect to the Palestinian and Israeli situation for all the resolution that has been passed all these years?
Well, I think there's sort of two parts of that. The HRC's attempt to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just a broader symptom of how the UN system has tried to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where there's really kind of two separate things happening. You have the Secretariat with the Secretary General and the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, et cetera, who are engaged in the quartet process, who are very important players in the actual diplomatic process of getting the Israelis and Palestinians to negotiate a final agreement with each other. And then you have a sideshow. And quite honestly, everything that takes place in the bodies that vote on resolutions at the UN related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is totally ineffective at doing anything to address this conflict. If anything, what it does is it sends a message to Israel that you can't trust the rest of the international community because they're so biased towards the Palestinian side. And it's actually just driven them into a very recalcitrant mode. There has been no interaction. And part of that, I think, is just reflected in the bias. Like I said, the US has no objection to the human rights situation in Israel and in the territories being addressed at the HRC. But the current mandate for the Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories is only allowed to look at Israeli violations. And it is expressly forbidden to look at any human rights violations and abuses committed by the Palestinian Authority, by Hamas, et cetera. I mean, that is totally ridiculous to say that you can look at what Israelis are doing in the West Bank without also looking at what Palestinians are doing to violate the human rights of both Israelis and of other Palestinians as well, by the way, especially if you look at the Hamas government and what they're up to. It's also the only special rapporteur who isn't term limited. Every country rapporteur has to be renewed on an annual basis, and every thematic rapporteur of the HRC has to be renewed every 3 years. This rapporteur's term of office expires at the end of the occupation. Why should any country be expected to engage with the HRC on those issues in a manner that is totally different from every single other one? So you have a category of bad states that includes Syria, North Korea, Iran, Burma, etc. They get handled in one way, and then you treat Israel in a way that is 20 times more biased than that. And it's no wonder that none of these resolutions accomplish anything. One of them is an annual resolution on the situation of human rights in the occupied Syrian Golan. It's a separate standalone resolution. It passed with 37 votes in the last HRC session in the last March. We were going around to countries prior to that and saying, look at the situation on the Israeli side of the ceasefire line versus the situation on the Syrian side of the ceasefire line. This is absurd that this resolution is even being considered at this time. But you have a large block of states that just has a knee-jerk vote for this stuff, and it's a real problem. And unless the Palestinians and the Organization for Islamic Cooperation and others that sort of lead on these efforts are willing to recalibrate and retool these in a manner that is balanced, I don't think you'll see the Israelis engage. If you do, then we'll work to try and get the Israelis to engage with it.
Steve?
Two sets of questions. This is a wonderful discussion. Thank you for the wonderful history and the more recent history of the successes the U.S. has had in pursuing this. I'm Steve Mosley. I'm a volunteer at UNA-NCA. Two questions. One is, to what extent, I suppose looking forward to 2016 re-election and vote whipping, do some of the new technologies protecting our sovereignty, at least this administration's view of our sovereignty, drone warfare or the NSA broad reach, most recently the New York Times reported last Sunday that the spying is used to help support the U.S. role on trade negotiations with Indonesia. And while that may be denied, it suggests there were enough facts to suspect that's the case, but I'm wondering to what extent those issues make your job more difficult, or how are those issues likely to have some influence on the trust for the U.S. to play the very long-term historical role it's had? So that's one question. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's my fair set of questions. I was going to ask, though, also because we started to talk about it, the new proposed 2015 goals. Two of those goals, one is peace building, and the other is human rights, have certainly been advocated to be their own goals by the NGO community. Got into that, and yet that could be problematic. And I know you're beginning to consider what that would be. I don't know whether you want to talk about peacekeeping or just human rights, but that's a dilemma, I think, coming up in the next 18 months, how to resolve that in a way that's beneficial for having the goals. The U.S., I hope, will be supportive, but whether it will should be on human rights. So those two issues, one having to do with your job with some policies, and the other having to do with the upcoming goals issue. Thank you.
I'll take the second one.
Maybe Ed wants to comment on those.
It sounds like the White House press corps, you've worked about 3 questions.
I'll start with the last question because it's the one that I actually have the least to say on. Because first of all, the HRC as a body is not where the post-2015 development goals are really going to be fleshed out. That's going to happen in New York, and it's going to happen mostly within the guise of the General Assembly and a process that's really being led by the Secretary General's office itself and by the Secretary General. I can't really speak as to how peacekeeping is going to be covered in that. That's an area that I don't engage in directly, but we do believe it's going to be very important that the post-2015 goals address human rights in an appropriate way, and whether that's in a standalone fashion or that is through sort of mainstreaming human rights issues throughout the entire thing. That is a discussion that is still ongoing. We're still working as a government, and we're still working in consultation with American NGOs as well to reach our final positions as to what the U.S. is going to advocate. In the end, it will be absolutely essential that we get something that the United States and that every member state of the UN can join consensus on, because that's what made the Millennium Development Goals so tremendously successful, is that they are a set of important aspirations, some of which have been met much more so than others, but have really driven forward the development agenda on really important issues, and we want to see that continue. As to the tough issues, we would call them the defensive issues, those on which the U.S. is under assault in the international human rights context. Drones and privacy are probably the two toughest ones there, but Guantanamo Bay is another issue that comes up pretty regularly at the Human Rights Council as well. I don't see those impacting our re-election. We're running against Greece and the UK so far for 2 seats. The Greeks really like to run against the US for the HRC.
The cradle of democracy.
Yeah, they've still never been elected to the council, and I think they're going to have a hard time against the US and the UK in the end, just because of our diplomatic capacity and things as much as anything. If your human rights record alone elected you to the HRC, then Saudi Arabia wouldn't have been elected this year, Cuba wouldn't have been elected, Vietnam got the most votes of any country, unfortunately.
Those are pretty low bars.
So those are easy ones for me to jump over, right? But the reality is, yes, we have these tough issues, but the US is actually engaging at the UN on these issues. When privacy has come up, both in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, we haven't run into the corner. We've engaged head on to try and get the UN to be able to reach a series of conclusions that the US can join.
Tell us a little more then, Wes, about the specifics of the German and the Brazilian resolutions and the public comments that were made by the presidents and political leaders in those 2 countries, leading then to a draft resolution that was very critical, and Uncle Sam then watering it down. Tell us a little bit more about what happened and what the outcome was.
My question's more polite than that.
Yeah, I was not involved in the negotiations on that specific resolution myself. There's other people on our team that were, so I don't actually know the inside baseball down to the day. But what I do know is
You're still wearing the locker room.
I was indeed, and so what I can say is, you know, we could have just said no and called a vote and voted against. We would have probably gotten the UK and Canada to do it with us. The US isn't afraid to call votes on issues where we believe that the General Assembly is out of line with international law, and we will do so when we have to. But we felt that it was very important that Germany and Brazil are actually good friends and important friends in the United States and partners, and it was important for us to be able to reach a compromise position that we could all agree to. And it was tough. Those are not easy negotiations to engage in, but we are at the UN both to push an agenda on certain issues, but also we are at the UN to protect our vital national interests, and how we both go about conducting our national defense and our counterterrorism operations are an important part of that. And that plays into the drones issue as well, and that's another one that's very tough. And it's a difficult issue for us to engage in at the UN, but you know, the administration believes that we are on firm international legal as well as domestic legal ground with the operations that we conduct. And that is the position with which we have to engage other states at the UN on it.
But let's push that a little bit further, Wes. I don't want to interrupt. But what I see in the dynamic here is that as more and more complicated issues like this play out internationally, there are other agencies of the US government which have a much greater interest, a much greater investment, much greater influence than people like yourself in the IO Bureau of the State Department. Doesn't this mean then, to some extent, that the State Department gets sidelined? And what do you do about this as the dynamics of issues and power shift?
I don't actually feel like we have been sidelined in any of those discussions, in the internal discussions. We are taking a whole of government approach to how we address that. And the State Department is a national security agency. And as such, as a member of the national security community, you know, it's important for us to, DOD would like us to just walk. Their view when these issues comes up is just don't engage. That's their preference. We know that that's the wrong answer, that in the long run that's going to lead to worse outcomes for them as well. And so we've won that fight within the interagency to engage on these tough issues and to address them. And you know, as our position evolves, both as an administration and as Congress, if it will step in and change how it oversees these programs as well, you know, the U.S. will ensure that our national position is what we carry out at the UN.
Okay, question here?
Sorry, this is kind of a long question, so I really apologize. As somebody who grew up in the 90s and who lived in East Africa, my view of the UN was very much colored by Rwanda, obviously. And at the time, I remember there being a lot of talk about how the Human Rights Commission had been telling everyone terrible things are going to happen, and how the Security Council was basically we're not going to do anything. And then after it all went down, there's talk about how there's going to be a lot more cooperation and coordination between the Human Rights Committee and the Security Council. And then now, 20 years later, we're seeing situations like North Korea that just came up, where the Human Rights Commission gave this very scathing report and the Security Councils might not do anything, or Syria, where we're having two different views. So I was wondering what progress has been made in terms of attaining those goals of more collaborative work.
Yeah, that's actually, it's a really great question. And even on the cases of Syria and North Korea, I think what the Human Rights Council is doing is impacting discussions that take place inside the Security Council on those issues. For instance, the Commission of Inquiry for Syria has now held 2 ARIA formula briefings for the Security Council. So that's where they meet with all 15 of the permanent representatives together and present what they have found. And we're looking to do the same as well for North Korea, so that we can take these experts that are appointed by the HRC and have them directly engage the Security Council on issues that should be at the attention of the Security Council.
But the spoiler states are saying the Security Council ought to stay out of this kind of thing.
Yeah, but they haven't been able to keep the Security Council from having those discussions. And similarly, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, she plays a very important role at the Security Council. She regularly travels from Geneva to New York and briefs the Security Council on important human rights issues. We're down now to only 3 peacekeeping missions in the world that don't have a human rights component. Every other UN peacekeeping mission in its mandate specifies that human rights are part of its work. There are human rights monitors and technical advisors in these peacekeeping missions that are engaging directly on the ground in those issues. So that's a really great example of how the Security Council is better engaging on human rights than we saw in the past. As recently as the mid-1990s, human rights component of a peacekeeping mission was an unheard of thing, and we've managed to grandfather it in to most of the other peacekeeping missions since. So it certainly is engaged. I mean, there will always be an inherent tension there because the UN in its own charter has its sort of separation of powers, just like we have in our government, and the Security Council is one of those branches, if you will, of the UN architecture. The Human Rights Council is a part of the General Assembly branch. It's a subsidiary body to the General Assembly, so it does not have a oversight role or any kind of direct role with the Security Council as far as its sort of legal structure within the UN. But we're finding more and more ways for the HRC to interact with the UN and for the HRC to address situations that can then move on to the Security Council. Syria is tough, North Korea is tough, but the HRC, after its special session on Libya, it was only days before the Security Council had referred the situation in Libya to the ICC. That wouldn't have happened without the HRC asking for it first and it going from them through the UN channel to the Security Council. So that pressure worked in that case. And it's not going to everywhere because the 5 veto-wielding powers, the United States included, have interests that are going to keep us from allowing that to happen in certain cases. Syria is the most tragic example that we're watching play out right now with the Russians. North Korea is under the wing of China in the same way. There are other states that would levy that same criticism about Israel on the United States. There are other countries under the French and British wing as well that you're just not going to see the Security Council engage on that as much. But we're really seeing it play out in really remarkable ways and in ways that I think those who wrote the charter in the 1940s never would have been able to imagine that the UN would be able to do.
Yes, sir.
I'm Larry Dinger. You mentioned the situation last fall regarding the HRC resolution and how complicated that got. One of the criticisms that was raised by some in New York was that while all or nearly all of the 193 UN members have missions in New York, a smaller number have missions in Geneva and can conveniently join in HRC deliberations if they get voted onto it. Some nations are just too poor or too small to be able to accomplish that sort of thing. Do you sense that that is a flaw that the HRC has, and is there anything that could be done about it?
I don't. There's actually only 21 UN member states that don't have a mission in Geneva. So that's actually, it's a relatively small number of states that do not. And some states like Sierra Leone, which previously did not have representation in Geneva, ran for the HRC and are there now. Any member state can run for the HRC, and we're looking at how can we sort of creatively engage to help some of these states do so. We've approached individual states in the past and asked them to consider running, that the US would be willing to try and help who are not currently in Geneva. But there's multiple ways that states who aren't in Geneva can still engage at the HRC. One, they can send somebody from New York or their capital still during a session, and we see that happen quite frequently with some of those 21 members. They've all shown up for their UPR. So it's not like they never go to Geneva and never engage there at all. We've also started reaching out to those states that are in New York only to be able to still sign joint statements and co-sponsor resolutions in Geneva, even though they're not physically present. So that was something that was never tried till the US joined. And the first time we tried it was on an LGBT joint statement in March of 2011. We got 7 countries that aren't in Geneva to sign the statement. And they just passed a diplomatic note in New York saying we joined the statement, and we got them on. So we actually can engage on those issues with those states. And that is the right answer to this. Any state can run for the HRC, and for those that don't have the capacity to be in Geneva and choose not to run, they should still work through the members of their regional group, or come to states like the US, to any other member state, so that we are aware of their positions and that we can act on behalf of the full membership of the UN. I mean, that's the whole point of these elected bodies to the UN, whether they sit in New York or Geneva. The HRC is more effective and faster able to address situations because it has 47, not 193 members. And all 193 members agreed to that when the body was created. So they've set up the beast, and that some of them don't like it because of that. But the ambassador that was leading the charge against that HRC resolution was actually from an African state that is based in Geneva. It was not an ambassador. It was really a spurious argument that he was making in that respect. We think that there's ways for all states to engage the HRC, but the way to do that isn't to re-adjudicate.
Question right here.
I'm Bert Wise. I'm a pro bono counsel to a number of ethnic and religious human rights defender groups oppressed in various countries. I have one question, but it's got two related parts. There's been a lot in the media about conflicts of interest in our government, people going in and out. In a related concept, I'm wondering if there's been any precedent in the UNCA on members of the council abstaining or being asked to abstain if the issue either generally or even more so specifically relates to them. I have in mind, for example, China, which, although North Korea I would give pride of place, runs North Korea a close second as being the torture capital of the world. And when the last Universal Periodic Review made a number of recommendations, they ignored all but a handful of negligible ones. They would not let the COI for North Korea even look into the refoulement question at their borders. And I'm wondering if, for example, the U.S. were to contemplate, I don't know it's likely, a COI for China, would there be any mechanism for suggesting that they abstain? The related part is that, in my experience, the stronger human rights mechanism at the UN is the Committee Against Torture. And the requirement of all the countries that are parties to file reports as to their compliance, China has done that, and the chairman of the committee, the dean of American University Law School, has permitted a much more vigorous examination of their report than I've seen for the Universal Periodic Reviews. But as I'm sure you know, Article 22 of that convention allows countries to abstain or refuse to submit to the Committee Against Torture's jurisdiction to actually hear complaints against the country and to function in a quasi-judicial way to investigate and adjudicate. China has not agreed to that jurisdiction, and interestingly, the U.S. has not agreed to it, even though, unlike concern about violating laws of other countries under a SOFA, it deals with whether we're complying with an agreement that we are a party to. And I'm wondering if there's been any consideration to the U.S. withdrawing that and agreeing to the jurisdiction, which might put pressure on China to agree to it.
On the second part first, the reservation that the U.S. made at the time of ratification of the treaty, that is part of the Senate ratification. So if we were to withdraw a reservation from a treaty, it would require the 2/3 vote of the United States Senate to change the reservations that the U.S. has towards the
Well, my
treaty.
question was
So-
whether the administration has given any thought to proposing it.
Right now, our priorities at the Senate on the treaty front are, number one, the Convention on Persons with Disabilities, and the second one is on the Law of the Sea Convention. We haven't even been able to move on those, despite huge numbers of eminent Americans and influence groups from all across the spectrum coming forward for both of those. So I don't think the administration is actually really considering any other human rights related or other major UN treaties or changing reservations on any other treaties at all until we can get past that particular thing. As far as your first question about sort of abstaining on issues that are related to you, I mean, the HRC isn't a judicial body, it is a political body. And by its very nature, that means that all elected members of the HRC have the right to vote and take a position on every issue that comes before that particular institution. The US, I think, would be very much opposed to a position being taken whereby states should abstain on issues where it may pertain to that state. That would mean that the United States would abstain on privacy issues, on drones, et cetera, when those issues come before the HRC, if those issues were principally targeted at the United States. And we would argue that if those come forward in a way that don't conform with our foreign policy, that we should have a right to use our vote as an elected member to vote on that issue. However, the HRC does actually have a unique mechanism in place by which a member of the HRC that commits grave violations of human rights may be suspended from the HRC. When that was done, we figured that it probably would never be successfully implemented, that it was something that would look good on paper and add some credibility to the institution, but was unlikely to ever take place. But in 2011, that changed when Libya, who was an elected member of the HRC at the time, decided to turn the guns on their own population. And the HRC special session recommended to the General Assembly the suspension of Libya, which took place, so the special session was on February 28th. The GA turned around the very next day. I've never seen the UN move so fast in my life on anything, and suspended Libya from the HRC. After Gaddafi was overthrown and the new government was in place, and they went before the HRC and made commitments to improve their human rights record and to engage, and we passed a technical cooperation resolution with Libya that cemented in their cooperation with the UN on human rights. The Human Rights Council recommended to the GA to reinstate Libya's membership, and they were reinstated through the remainder of their term, which set an incredibly good precedent for us, and one that, that hopefully, if needed, can be employed again in the future. But that required, the threshold for that is these sort of grave, acute violations. And to achieve it, you have to get a majority vote in the General Assembly. Everyone's been elected by that majority vote, so there are not the votes for China to be suspended from the HRC for anything that they may be doing at home or any such thing, because they won more votes than that just to get elected. And membership is a big challenge for the HRC, but I actually do have kind of a converse to that, because it's a very controversial issue here, and it's one that members of Congress, especially UN skeptics, tend to raise regularly with us, is how is the Human Rights Council really an effective or credible institution if states like China and Russia and Cuba can be members? The Human Rights Council is only an effective institution for human rights if it actually reflects the broader international community. And if there's some sort of litmus test as to who is on in that respect, I think that's a problem. The worst of the worst, the Syrias and the Irans and the North Koreas should not be elected to the HRC. And when they try to run for seats, the US works very hard to ensure that they don't. And Iran was running this last year, and we were able to make the situation so uncomfortable for them that they withdrew from the election. They didn't even make it all the way to voting day. But having countries that aren't the best of the best on the council is of value, because otherwise it looks like this club of lecturing Western countries that tell the rest of the world what to do. But right now, instead, we have small developing countries that have challenges at home who are committing to do better and are through their votes, through their voice, through the resolutions they work on, they're making a commitment to do better at home and to promote that around the world. And I think that actually has a lot of value.
Thank you. Now, I know we've kept you a long time. It's the dinner hour for many of you. We have 3 people lined up for questions here. Let's have the 3 questions in a row, and then we'll have a short answer, and then we'll ask Sultan Ali to come and make some closing remarks. She's co-chair of our Human Relations Committee in the UNA-NCA, and I hope she'll tell us a little bit about some of the work of UNA-NCA in the human rights area. And then we'll have an informal conversation. We can continue. I hope we can convince our panelists to stick around for a few minutes, and if you've got follow-up questions, that would be terrific as well. So let's have 3 quick questions, and then we'll wrap up the formal part up with Sultan.
Ken Lemberg, I'm a volunteer on the UNA-NCA committee and have other roles too. First of all, that last point you made was very interesting about the different member states and their track records and whether they should be on or not. I also want to quickly commend the questioners and commend your answer about Israel, because the perception of a country being perceived as being singled out over a fair number of years in terms of a number of different resolutions. To take another example, and it may be way too early to tell, with what's going on in Ukraine in real time, how might the Human Rights Council get involved, play a role? Is it basically observer right now? Again, it may be premature to even comment very much.
Okay, let's take these other 2 questions.
Hi, my name is Jesse Marr. I'm the Human Rights Director for the Church of Scientology National Affairs Office. You made a very good comment about national judiciary courts taking into account the norms that are set by the United Nations, and even if they're not beholden to rule by these, they do look at them because they know that's what the world thinks. And I know the State Department definitely supports the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and especially out in the rest of the world, but I'm wondering domestically, how much does the U.S. pay attention to UN regulations and norms that are set in its own Supreme Court and other federal rulings?
Farhana Shah, I'm volunteer member of UNA-NCA. My question is simple as well as challenging. That is, what is the status of implementation of Millennium Development Goals, especially social equity and education, which are to be achieved by 2015?
Okay, well, we'll start with Ukraine. It's unclear at this point exactly how the HRC will address that situation because it's very fluid at this point, but I think that it will be a big problem if the HRC does not address the Ukrainian situation in some way during the upcoming March session, which starts in just a little over a week on March 3rd. Ukraine is another country that happens to fall into my portfolio, so I've actually been spending a lot of time over the last few days working with our colleagues that work solely on the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, as well as our colleagues that work with the European Union and others, to sort of brainstorm on where that's going to go. Not knowing what the situation will look like even by March 3rd, let alone by the end of the council session, I would be afraid to opine on the specifics of where we're going to end up. But it's on our radar screen, and we're looking at how to best address the situation. I think that's also important for a broader issue, which one of the criticisms leveled before the HRC is it spends all its time looking at developing countries, and the West just uses the HRC to beat up on the rest of the world. And so it's important when situations break out in places like Europe that traditionally aren't the focus of these bodies, that those issues be addressed as well. On how does the US abide by what takes place at the UN? The US actually, I think we're the only country in the world that won't vote for a UN resolution unless it's implementable and in line with our laws and policies domestically. And it drives a lot of other countries crazy in negotiations because we'll come in with the tiniest little legal tweaks to language that are absolutely necessary to take that into account. Part of that is, of course, we have kind of a unique system. You know, if the French central government decides to do something, it is done, right? But we have a federal system here. And so we won't agree to things at the UN, and we will not sign on to things at the UN that do not align with our law and policy and with the ability of the United States government to be able to carry out those obligations. When that comes down to treaties, of course, once a treaty is ratified by the US Senate, that is the law of the land. And at that point, it isn't the State Department's responsibility to carry out that treaty if those obligations take place within the domestic sphere. So then the State Department works with the rest of the United States government to do so. Same actually plays when we negotiate at the UN. So if it's a resolution on education issues, the Department of Education is involved in the negotiations on the text of the resolution. If it's on health issues, Health and Human Services plays a role, etc. And we do take that very seriously. I wish I had more that I could tell you on Millennium Development Goals. Unfortunately, those actually fall to a different part of my bureau. The Millennium Development Goals are not principally about human rights. They're principally about international development, and we have a separate office in my bureau that handles that. With the original 10 goals, of course, some of them are much closer to having been met than other ones. We believe, though, for those goals that have not been met by the year 2015, that they should not be tossed aside, that those aspirations should remain essentially on the books, if you will, as we continue to work towards achieving them, because all of them, including the education pillars and some of these that are very tough, these are important aspirations that we need to continue to work to address with the entire global community. Where that's going to come out on January 1st, 2015, how much of it was met or not, remains to be seen, but I actually do think it's impressive how much we have achieved based on those, and I think they actually provide an incredibly interesting and relevant blueprint to look at how the UN as a body can set a series of aspirational goals for the world that really focused a lot of attention on a series of important issues and led to a lot of big steps being taken by, especially by the donor states, but of course, even the smallest and poorest states in the world agreed to those and have done what they can with their own domestic abilities as well to reach them. So we're taking very seriously the next step, and we want to ensure that the post-2015 goals, similar to those from the Millennium Development Goals, are simple and clear standards that can be set and can help focus the international community going forward after 2015.
Thank you. Can we please get a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you. I think I speak on behalf of our committee when I say that we are proud and pleased to have a representative like Wesley, who is advocating tirelessly for human rights and representing us with the Human Rights Council. So another round of applause. I don't know about you, but it's really exciting to get the inside baseball of how this takes place, because I think when we talk about something like the Human Rights Council, you know, here in the United States, we don't have the situation where we have UN vehicles rolling down the street like you might have in some developing countries. And I know a lot of you have been to developing countries or come from developing countries where you have seen the UN vehicles, you see UN peacekeepers, and you have that presence. So for a lot of Americans here in the United States, there's this feeling of disconnect between why do I pay my, what is it, $7, or I forget how much it is. It's not very much that really actually goes to the UN from taxpayer dollars. But people may say, why do we need to pay this money? And I'm from Florida, where there's billboards that say get the US out of the UN along Interstate 4, and I fought the tireless battle of holding up the UN flag in all kinds of areas. And speaking to all kinds of groups. So it's a battle that we fight, and we proudly fight it at the United Nations Association, and you know, we're one of the only NGOs that really advocates for the UN here in the US. So I think for those of you here who are not currently members of the United Nations Association, I would just echo Don Bliss's sentiments that you consider joining. I've been a member since 2002 and have grown my own leadership and my own interest in human rights and many other issues through the United Nations Association. There's incredible opportunities for people of all ages, from all backgrounds and demographics, to get involved and to be a part of conversations like this, where you don't always get the opportunity to have such an intimate look into what happens at the United Nations and on a lot of different types of issues. A year ago, I think it was just about this time a year ago, that we had our first Human Rights Committee meeting, and I was handed the very awesome task of restructuring and reforming and relaunching the Human Rights Committee. And I'm really excited to introduce Christina Hansen. If you could stand up and give a wave. Christina Hansen is our new co-chair, and I'm really excited. I think just a month in, she's been a volunteer with us for the last year and has certainly proven herself. So she and I are going to continue to carry the torch throughout this year. And some of the things we have coming up on our agenda next month for International Women's Day and Women's Month, towards the end of March, we're going to be doing an event on women in education. We've not posted those details. We're currently finalizing our panelists and venue and all of that good kind of detail. So please stay tuned to the UNA-NCA website, UNA-NCA.org, and check out our events that are going to be coming out. Some of the other things we're going to be doing, we're planning to do an Eleanor Roosevelt birthday happy hour in October for UN Month. For those of you who did not partake in UN Month last year, UNA-NCA does an incredible job of lining up a series of events to celebrate the anniversary of the UN, the birth of the UN, and it's just an incredible month and lineup of events, and we're really, really excited to be doing something that really is all about the mother of human rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, who just did incredible work. I mean, when you read the backstory, again, going into the inside baseball of how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came about, what she did was, it was such important work, and it was an almost impossible task. Because even right after World War II, the dynamics of the world were changing so quickly. She got into this very small window where she was able to get consensus, and that window closed very, very quickly. It's really incredible. I encourage you to read more about the history of that if you haven't already. And then, of course, we're going to be closing out the year in December with our annual Human Rights Awards. So those of you from other organizations, we invite you to submit nominees for those awards. It's really one of the only awards programs that I'm aware of, at least here in the Washington area, that awards champions of human rights. And we were able to honor a lot of different people over the years, just incredible people. And so we're looking forward to doing another incredible event on Capitol Hill, and definitely invite you to be a part of that. So those of you who are volunteers in the Human Rights Committee, this is a very active committee. If it's something that you're interested in and you really want to make a difference in human rights, please talk to myself, talk to Christina after the event. We'll give you our email. And one of the things that we're doing that's new, we are launching an advocacy initiative within our committee. We didn't want to take that on the first year because it's a pretty big job, but as you could hear from Wesley, there's a lot of needs. The law of the sea, all of these other kinds of things, and being the advocates that we are for the UN and for human rights, it's our job to take up that mantle. So we are going to be doing that. We've been baby stepping into that process, but we really need people who have energy, who have insight, who have ideas, and who have connections. So we are looking for you. So please talk to Christina. She's actually, we're looking for somebody to actually lead that. She's the interim subcommittee chair, so to speak, but we're looking for somebody to lead that effort. And like anybody in our committee, you kind of grow through a series of tasks and leading a series of tasks, so we're really excited to be doing that. So definitely stay tuned to the website, and we look forward to seeing you at some of those future events. And I just want to say thank you so much to Wesley, thank you to Ed, and we are really excited. Thank you to AFSA for this fantastic partnership. This will not be the last event we do with AFSA. We're very excited to have more events in the future and to build this and other partnerships. And I'll just close with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, since she's my favorite, which just came to my mind while I was sitting here and listening to just some of the difficulties that are involved that we take for granted sometimes, in whether it's moving forward our campaign to get elected to the Human Rights Council, or any number of myriad things. She said, and I'm going to try to not mess this up, but she said, courage is more exhilarating than fear, and in the long run, it is easier. We do not have to become heroes overnight, just one step at a time, meeting each thing that comes up, seeing that it is not as dreadful as it appeared, discovering that we have the strength to stare it down. Thank you.